So I was just minding my own business when a friend said, "Hey Damon, you should watch The Family on Netflix. It's about fundamentalist evangelicals." And I thought to myself, yeah, okay, sure, yeah, I'll check it out. Whatever, I've seen all those old Westboro Baptist documentaries. I've seen the videos about people who escaped their very fundamentalist culty family. It's all been done before. I've seen it before. Then I actually watched it. I was so wrong. I had no idea what I was in for.
In my 20s, I stumbled my way in. And what I found is a secretive Christian organization called The Family that had been hiding in plain sight for over 80 years.
This was a group with tentacles around the world.
A humble example of leadership that the world has never seen.
A breathtaking enmeshment of church and state.
There were congressmen, senators, world leaders.
And they say it's about faith, but there's a shared understanding that what we're really about here is power.
Pretty intense, right? As an ex-evangelical myself, we need to talk about this, and we need to talk about Christofascism. Okay, so my name is Damon Garcia. I'm a Christian leftist, which means I believe saying yes to Jesus means saying no to fascism, no to imperialism, no to capitalism, and other injustices. That feels kind of obvious, but to a lot of people it's not, so that's why I gotta distinguish myself. Subscribe if you want to hear more about that. So having these views, this kind of makes me look like a bit of a heretical black sheep compared to popular Christianity, and so often when people think of Christians, they think of people like this that we're gonna talk about today. These very right-wing evangelicals who just seek more and more power and control. And I've made some videos about this before, particularly about the rise of the moral majority and the religious right and how that all started in the 70s and 80s. But they were able to do what they did because of the foundation laid by the family or the fellowship. This series is based on a book by Jeff Charlotte, and as you saw in the trailer, he was part of the group for just a very, very short period of time in his 20s, but he continued to see their influence all over the place after he left for years because he got to have a glimpse at the root of all this, and which enabled him to see it way clearer than anyone else. And what's especially unnerving about this is that after I watched this series, I started talking about it with other ex-evangelical friends, and I realized, oh my God, if you were ever a part of an evangelical church, especially if you were ever involved in ministry and knew other people in ministry in evangelical churches, chances are you just have a couple degrees of separation between you and this family, the organization, the fellowship. Because as I've started to talk to people about it, I had a friend say, oh yeah, I knew a guy who was one of the leaders in this house, the Cedars, who asked me one day, hey, if you ever want to get connected with this thing that I used to be a part of, I could totally connect you. And then I talked to another friend who was like, oh yeah, I almost worked for a guy who was a part of this. And then I talked to another friend that was like, oh yeah, I'm friends with a guy who still works for them. It's like only a couple degrees of separation, and that's kind of creepy. And what's also super unnerving is that a lot of the language I grew up hearing in the evangelical church, you can literally trace that back, not to the Bible or not to the beginning of Protestantism or the beginning of evangelicalism, but you can literally trace that back to the theology of the family and the way they talked about the Bible and the way they talked about Jesus. Those scenes in the boys' house in the first episode, especially when they're reading the Bible together and talking about Jesus plus nothing, and talking about praying to be broken for God, to be absolutely obedient and subservient to the will of God, and to pray to get rid of your inner rebel. I grew up around all that language, and a lot of that isn't necessarily biblical. It comes from something else. I'm gonna read a timeline of events here. I'll link it below. This is a Mother Jones article written in 2010 by Jeff Charlotte, so it gives a nice summary so we don't have to read the entire book together. So this was all started in 1935 by a preacher named Abraham Vereide. So 1935, Seattle preacher Abraham Vereide experiences a revelation. The revelation being Christianity is about helping the strong, not the weak. Very, very unbiblical. He sets out to organize an anti-New Deal coalition of Christian businessmen. Also among this original group of Christian businessmen included Frank Bushman, who started the Oxford Group. Back then, Frank Bushman said things like, "But think what it would mean to the world if Hitler surrendered to the control of God, or Mussolini, or any dictator. Through such a man, God can control a nation overnight and solve every last bewildering problem." And Vrede ended up adopting a lot of this language as well. Also, a very troubling quote from Frank Bushman was, "Human problems aren't economic, they're moral, and they can't be solved by immoral measures. They could be solved within a God-controlled democracy, or perhaps I should say a theocracy, and they could be solved through a God-controlled fascist dictatorship." By the way, I literally grew up around some people, not all people, this was rare, but some people that would unironically, without any reservation or hesitation, say things like, "Yeah, we should really have a theocracy. I'm totally for a theocracy." And when they said that, what they were actually imagining was putting a man as president who would decide things, decide policy, decide what to do for the country, in the country, what the country should do, by praying to God and directly getting the answers. Like there's people out there who think that that's what we should do. And as someone who believes in God, I know that's super ridiculous. Also, Frank Bushman was well known for popularizing the whole concept of quiet time, a time where you can just sit in silence for about 30 minutes and just listen for the voice of God. Just sit in silence and wait until God speaks to you and then act upon it. That's a relatively new idea, because usually in the history of Christianity, in the history of all religion, what they want you to do is actually engage with the history of your tradition and engage with the sacred texts of your tradition and engage with others who are also within your community and in your tradition. This is like in the name of piety saying, forget all that, just you and Jesus, you and God, that's all you need. Just sit there and listen for the voice of God. That's all you need. You don't need all that other stuff. And through his quiet time that he shared with Abraham Vrede, they got this revelation together that Christianity is about helping the strong, not the weak, which, oh my God, so awful. Anyway, 1940, success. Despite accusations of fascist sympathies, one of Vrede's men, Arthur B. Langley, is elected governor of Washington, and he was totally against the working class, destroyed labor, and pretty much got rid of most of the left in Washington at that time. 1942, having established prayer groups of politicians and businessmen across the country, Vrede moves his operation to Washington, D.C. Howard Coonley, ultra-right president of the National Association of Manufacturers, invites several dozen congressmen to Vrede's Capitol Hill debut. 1946, State Department sends Vrede on a mission to scour Allied prisons for Nazi war criminals willing to switch allegiance from the Fuhrer to our father. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, this is real, this is real. 1953, Eisenhower reluctantly agrees to come to the first national prayer breakfast. He was reluctant because he was like, separation of church and state, that's obvious. That would be weird if we had a national prayer breakfast. But he goes anyway, especially because they were in a war with communist USSR and felt like, okay, that's the atheist nation over there. How do we win this war? Let's just lean way, way, way more on Christianity over here. That's how they convinced Eisenhower to actually say yes to a national prayer breakfast. Envisioned by Vrede as an annual ritual to consecrate the nation's political leadership for Jesus. Attended by every president since, the breakfast will become the movement's most potent recruiting tool, with foreign leaders invited for FaceTime with U.S. politicians and businessmen. Oil and defense especially well represented. 1959, Senator Frank Carlson, a leader of the movement Vrede has incorporated under the umbrella of international Christian leadership, takes a delegation of U.S. businessmen to Haiti to meet a promising young leader. With their support, he'll become dictator Papadoc Duvalier. Oh man. 1965, CIA-supported General Suharto takes power in Indonesia through what the spy agency will later admit is one of the worst mass murders in the 20th century. Verady and his understudy Douglas Coe, remember that name, consider it a spiritual revolution and organize junkets for congressmen and oilmen who will become Suharto's champions in Washington. 1969, Verady gets promoted to heaven, and Douglas Coe assumes leadership and takes Verady's publicity-shy approach to new extremes, submerging the organization and instructing congressmen not to speak of what he begins calling the family.
I'd like to single out Doug Coe.
Doug Coe and all of his associates. I'm grateful.
Doug Coe is the longtime leader of the family.
He's the most powerful man in Washington you've never heard of.
He said the more invisible you can make your organization, the more influence it will have.
Jesus plus nothing. It's a powerful thing.
1973, Coe introduces Watergate hatchet man Chuck Colson to what Colson will describe as a veritable underground of Christ's men all through government. Men who will vouch for Colson's early release from prison a year later and back him as he begins building his own conservative Christian ministry.
Using the National Prayer Breakfast, they dispatch representatives to build relationships with foreign leaders.
That is exactly the kind of meeting that I would want to exploit.
For the family, Jesus says you must go to those who are in positions of power.
God always uses imperfect vessels to do his perfect work. President Trump's an imperfect vessel.
Jesus is the answer, but Jesus and Capitol Hill don't mix.
Because we want our family to stay together.
And the rest of this timeline also involves this building called C Street, where they housed and counseled senators and congressmen and governors and helped them really just keep their career going. Even when they made mistakes, they had the support of the family. So I encourage you to watch this docuseries if you haven't already. It is very insightful and intriguing and enlightening. But I was researching Doug Coe more, and it's like everything I find about Doug Coe just screams fascism to me. He had this weird obsession and admiration for dictatorial leaders, and he admired the way they're able to unite their people under their regime, and talked about how we need to be like that for Jesus.
Jesus said, you have to put me before other people, and you have to put me before yourself. Hitler, that was a demand to be in the Nazi Party. You have to put the Nazi Party and its objectives ahead of your own life and ahead of other people. I've seen pictures of the young men in the Red Guard, 22 years old in China. A table laid out like a butcher table. They would bring in this young man's mother and father, lay her on the table with a basket on the end. He would take an axe and cut her head off. They have to put the purposes of the Red Guard ahead of their father, mother, brother, sister, and their own life. That was a covenant, a pledge. That's what Jesus said. Today, in Los Angeles, in the gangs, you violate the code, you're dead. It's happening every day, today, in this country, this very day. Taken right from the Scripture. Jesus Christ said, if you do not put me before your father, your mother, and your brother, and your sister, you cannot be my disciple. If you're going to have any movement that moves men and nations, you have to have that kind of commitment. Jesus knew that. That's the way the social order is run. If you don't run it that way, the social order goes into disarray.
Bro, it's not okay to take fascist language and replace all the scary words with Jesus and still be considered anything close to Christian. No. Like, turn in your Christian card. You have nothing to do with Jesus at that point. And if you're a Christian and you're actually completely fine with this kind of language, you maybe could come up with a counter argument with something like, no. Damon, you have it all wrong. Doug Coe and people who talk like this, they aren't taking fascist language and just replacing words with Jesus. No. This is our language, and these fascist leaders took our language and replaced God and Jesus with themselves. Logical take, but wrong. Wrong, first of all, because whenever a prophet in the Bible talks about a nation actually being fully obedient to God, they always describe an egalitarian society where everyone is equal, there are no kings, and all of the poor and marginalized are put to the forefront as the utmost priority. Yet so many of the Christians today who talk like this and talk about a theocracy or some sort of dominion theology, that is not what they plan on seeing in the world. They're usually talking about an ultra-nationalism, which the Bible preaches against constantly. Oh, and second of all, it's wrong because so many of these people, what they actually want to see in the world is just get the right man in power. All we need is just a good, righteous Christian man, put him in power, fully trust him, give him all he needs to change all the policies and change every way we create government in order to make it a God-led government and a God-led society. Give him all the power for him to do that. You're literally talking about putting a dictator in place. Also, even if you think that'll work, that dude's gonna eventually die and then someone else could take his place and maybe he won't be so Christian as you like him to be. That is the stupidest plan ever, and this whole idea of let's just get men in power to be all about Jesus and then everything will be fine, that doesn't work because they end up just twisting Jesus to meet their actual political agendas. And that's very much what the moral majority and the religious right is. It looks nothing like the Jesus of the Bible, but they use all the Jesus phrases and words. There's even this Jesus-y video series that Doug Coe did shortly before he died. And in there, he says this interesting, lovely quote from Jesus.
Jesus said, if you're my follower, if you're my disciple, if you're going to follow me, you will become a fountain.
Wow, that sounds really nice, a fountain. Except Jesus never said anything like that. And if you want to look at the whole Bible, the closest you could get to that is the Psalms talking about God being like a fountain of life. Jesus never said that. You making that up, Doug Coe. That's a lie. Okay, but it still sounds nice. It's kind of a cool, good thing to say. Be a fountain, man. Or let's see what he has to say about it.
I've never seen a fountain move 1 inch to give a drink to anybody. Fountains stay in place for 1,000 years. Jacob's well just stays Jacob's well in that spot. People come to the fountain doesn't go to the people. Evangelism is an outreach. Evangelism for Jesus is in reach. Reaching yourself so you become a fountain.
Okay, that's ridiculous. That's basically being like, don't go help people, accept the status quo. That's basically what he's trying to say with the quote of become like a fountain. And a lot of this language is about just accept the status quo, trust the few men that we put in power to do the Jesus stuff. And really, a lot of evangelical theology, a lot of fundamentalist theology, what it actually does is soften the brain in order to make it ripe for fascism. A lot of you out there don't know. You've been trained so much to just be obedient to the people in power and accept the status quo and to not rebel and not speak up, that if fascism comes, you'll be so ready for it. And that's exactly what they want. Evangelicalism has been co-opted so hard that it's probably past redemption. I would argue that Christianity in itself isn't past redemption because Christianity has hundreds and hundreds of years of anti-imperialist work. Evangelicalism is only like, 100 years old? Since the birth of Christianity, there's this long stream of course, colonizing and imperialism and fascism in the name of Jesus. And at the same time, since then, there's this long stream of people fighting against it in the name of Jesus. And history is usually on their side because they look more like Jesus, and the future church looks at that stream and says they were the correct ones. And I very much feel like evangelicalism is part of the stream of colonizing and not being a real good illustration of what Jesus should be like in the world. And the future church would look back on us and say, dang, evangelicalism was weird and really bad. Good thing we're not like that anymore. All of this also reminds me of those classic Bible verses I grew up hearing about false prophets, false teachers coming in and deceiving people. Like 2 Peter 2, but false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive opinions. Even so, many will follow their licentious ways, and because of these teachers, the way of truth will be maligned, and in their greed they will exploit you with deceptive words. I grew up with people saying that those false teachers were like the people who were trying to like accept people who were accepting gay marriage, people who were actually loving toward people of other faiths, people who believe that God is actually a better God than one that sends a bunch of people to torture in hell forever and ever. The people who were too nice. Turns out the false teachers ended up being the supposed God-fearing, Bible-believing, conservative Christian patriots. What a twist. We should all be anti-fascism, and I think if you're a Christian, you should especially be anti-fascism, even if it's got your guy's name attached to it. The family is fascist, the Proud Boys are fascist, the Patriot Prayer is fascist. Oh, and if you're thinking, oh wow, typical lefty calling everybody he disagrees with fascist. No, I use that word very carefully, and I'm referring to like the actual orthodox doctrine of fascism when I say it, and I very much believe a lot of you out there probably are fascists without even knowing it. And the reason you don't know it is because today we just associate the word fascist with like genocide, and so people think if you're not out there genociding people, then you're not a fascist. Wrong. Let me read you Umberto Eco's abridged list of the 14 signs of fascism. Very abridged. You could find the full list in the link in the description. First off, the cult of tradition. Second, the rejection of modernism. Third, the cult of action for action's sake. Fourth, disagreement is treason. Fifth, fear of difference. Sixth, appeal to social frustration. 7, the obsession with a plot. 8, the enemy is both strong and weak. 9, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. 10, contempt for the weak. 11, everybody is educated to become a hero. 12, machismo and weaponry. 13, selective populism. And 14, newspeak, which is just a very impoverished vocabulary and lack of education so that people don't think critically about the situation they're in. Think critically about the situation you're in, my friends. Set your mind free. Wake up. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Leave a like, leave a comment. Let's talk about this. And if you want to hear me talk more about this subject, I'm going live on Twitch tonight at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time to talk about more of this and to dive way deeper and talk about whatever you want to talk about. So go check me out on there, twitch.tv/whoisdamon. Give me a follow and I'll see you on there. Also, if you'd like to support me, I would greatly appreciate it. You could support me on my Patreon, patreon.com/Damon Garcia. Shout out to the patrons already on there: Karen in Colorado, Ranger Jenny, Refined Your Scene, James Finlay, Jacob McCarthy, Jack, Theory Plebe, and Mike Lodato. Thank you so much for making this possible. Go and support me if you want to see more videos so I could do this way more often with more production value even. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.